walking virtually along the world's most revered footpaths and connecting the global community of pilgrims. It's the Sacred Steps Podcast, available on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Broadcasting from the Shaymare Studios in Florida, here's your host, pilgrim, backpacker, and author, Kevin Donahue.
Buen Camino, pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps Podcast. On this show, we're walking virtually alongside pilgrims and authors, connecting a community of pilgrims from across the globe. I'm your host, Kevin Donahue, pilgrim, backpacker, and author of Sacred Steps, a pilgrimage journal. I've just returned from walking 3 pilgrimage routes in the UK, and today we're debuting 2 new episodes of the podcast, streaming back to back, sharing the highlights and details of my journeys. I've never done a back-to-back episode, so very quickly, let me explain that the second episode should immediately follow this one. If you're streaming on your podcast app or YouTube, be sure to click subscribe so that the second episode streams automatically on your device. For those of you who are subscribed to the channel on Facebook or Instagram, you've seen some of the photos from my trip. Today we're going beyond those images to discuss the walks in detail, my observations, and suggestions for those who are considering these pilgrimage routes for their own journey. And also, a little honest conversation. And this will be incredibly familiar to those who have walked the Camino de Santiago. I'm going to be discussing the emotions that come from finishing the journey and returning back to your own routine. So today, 2 episodes. Episode 5 and 6. We're walking England's Pilgrim's Way, the Via Francigena route in the UK, and the Pilgrim's Path across the North Sea to Holy Island. Before we begin, let's do our Season 2 book giveaway. I think we need like a big sound or trumpets or something. We're gifting a copy of Britain's Pilgrim Places to one of our followers. I received this same book as a gift from my wife when I began planning my walks in the UK way back in 2019. It's a visually stunning book, and it looks at 500 shrines and holy places in England, Scotland, and Wales. Commissioned by the British Pilgrimage Trust, every copy sold goes to help make pilgrimage more accessible in the UK. So I'm proud to be buying and gifting a copy to one of our subscribers. If you want to gift a copy of your very own, you can order it from the British Pilgrimage Trust website, which I'll list in our show notes below, or simply order your copy from Amazon. So without further ado, in celebration of Season 2 of the podcast and my 3 recently completed routes in the UK, I will be sending a copy of Britain's Pilgrim Places to Scott in Seattle, Washington. Scott, be checking your email so that I can get your mailing address. We can get this over to you. Congratulations. I trust you'll enjoy the photography and reading about these sacred sites. I hope it will inspire your next journeys in much the same way that it has helped to inspire mine. Next, let's hit the mailbag for a letter from one of our subscribers. This one comes in from John in the United States, who writes, "Dear Kevin, I found the podcast and I'm planning to do my first Camino de Santiago in the spring." Oh, that's fantastic. It seems as if everyone on Facebook who walks the Camino ends up with terrible blisters. Yes, it does seem that way on Facebook. That's something I'm afraid will happen to me as a first-time pilgrim walker. Do you get blisters? What advice do you have for a first-time walker? I hope you are well. Buen Camino, John. Buen Camino, John. Blisters are a very real concern, and you're right to be thinking about how you may avoid them, because that's really the key, avoidance. Your email and some recent conversations with other pilgrims is pushing me to maybe do a Camino 101 video on my sock system and how I avoid blisters. Quickly, blisters form from friction, right? Your skin rubbing, creating a hot spot that becomes an abrasion or develops blistering on your epidermis or just below. The secret to avoiding blisters is actually quite simple. Reduce or eliminate the friction. For years and years, my system has been to use Body Glide on the soles and curves of my feet. I wear a very thin wicking sock, and what that does is it pulls the excess moisture away from my foot. And then over that wicking sock, I wear a very high quality, medium cushion, wool hiking sock. Yes, wool. Even here in Florida, even in the summer, regardless of how hot it is, wool socks. Subscribe to Sacred Steps on YouTube, and I'll post a quick 5 to 7 minute video showing how you can reduce friction and eliminate blisters for your upcoming Camino de Santiago. Thank you so much for that email, John. If you have a question or comment or feedback about the podcast, send a note to our Facebook page or via Instagram or over on the website at sacredstepspodcast.com. So on today's episode, we're discussing my 3 walks in the UK, the Pilgrim's Way from London's Southwark Cathedral to Canterbury Cathedral, the English route of the Via Francigena from Canterbury to Dover, and the Pilgrim Path across the North Sea to Holy Island. If you're streaming on Apple Podcast or your favorite streaming app, I'll be sharing some photos, maps, and scenes from my recent walks. If you're interested in seeing those, you may want to stream this same episode over on YouTube. Whether you're on your podcast app or YouTube, you'll find all the links from today's discussions, and there are quite a few, down below in the show notes and online always at sacredstepspodcast.com. Since I've returned home, a lot of people have been asking, how was your pilgrimage? And I really appreciate the question and the messages. I started planning my UK trip in 2019, maybe just a week or so after returning from the Portuguese route of the Camino de Santiago. I was planning to walk this route in 2020, and then, of course, the global COVID pandemic. I postponed this walk to begin the California Mission Trail along the Pacific Ocean in the United States from San Diego, but the Pilgrim's Way has always been in my thoughts for more than 2 years. So getting to do this walk, after all the time spent planning, mapping out the routes, reading about the journey, and talking to pilgrims about English pilgrimage on the podcast, when I actually arrived in London to begin, it was emotional. And I want to say right at the beginning, I am so grateful to my family for their support because it absolutely would not have been possible without them. My wife is my greatest champion and believes in this path that I'm on in a way that humbles me. Pastors and priests talk about faith in terms of hope beyond reason, a confidence beyond certainty. And I'm really grateful to be loved and supported by someone who believes in me beyond measure. My son Jack is a tremendous support, and he has it in his mind that we'll be taking some of these next steps together as he becomes a teenager. And nothing would thrill me more. I truly hope we get to do these future walks together, Jack. But to have their support, allowing me to step away from work and my family responsibilities to pursue something meaningful on my own. You know, going on these trips alone and spending time away from my family, it's a gift that they give to me, and I'm so incredibly grateful for their support. So I arrived in London, a little emotional, well, maybe more than a little emotional, and after getting my entry test for COVID, I went directly to Southwark Cathedral. This is a very traditional starting point for the Pilgrim's Way, especially for those who wouldn't be walking to the Shrine of St. Thomas Becket from the north of England or from Scotland, as they would have likely made their way to London along footpaths or Roman roads, and then crossed the Thames over London Bridge before turning east towards Canterbury. Southwark is also the common starting point for pilgrims created by Chaucer in his legendary book, The Canterbury Tales. They gather in the inns and pubs of Southwark to create a walking group for safety and company for their journey to Canterbury Cathedral. So I arrive in Southwark and I meet my friend, English author Andy Bull. Andy and I first connected in 2020 as I was studying pilgrimage in the UK, and his book, Pilgrim Pathways, outlines almost 24 short walks in England, Scotland, and Wales. I'll link Andy's book in the show notes below. Andy and I recorded a podcast episode back in season 1 devoted to pilgrimage in the UK, and after spending an hour or two with him in London, we're definitely going to be broadcasting 1 or 2 more episodes together because Andy is just an exceptionally nice man. He's a good guy, and he's really a student of pilgrimage. So we're standing there on London Bridge, people just going about their business, walking by, and we're having this really in-depth, passionate discussion about a millennium of pilgrimage tradition in England. And now that I reflect back on that, I'm regretting that we didn't record it because it was just so nice to be with someone as knowledgeable and enjoyable as Andy. And it was there on London Bridge with Andy that I actually learned a few new surprises about the Pilgrim's Way. And the first was this: while Suffolk Cathedral would become the more traditional starting route for English pilgrims, it was not the original starting point. The original starting point was actually a small chapel that was constructed by King Henry II in the middle of Old London Bridge. Following the murder of Thomas Becket, Henry commissioned London Bridge. Unlike the span that we know now, Old London Bridge, as we would later refer to it, was a street, but also supported a row of homes over shops, making the bridge one of the most vital links across the Thames, but also one of the city's top 5 shopping districts. And in the middle of the bridge, Henry directed that a chapel be built in honor of St. Thomas Becket. And the chapel was quite well supported with donations and has been enlarged several times. Among the relics that was said to be held in the chapel of St. Thomas on the bridge was a fragment of the true cross of Christ. With the reliquary and the devotion to Thomas Becket, it was this chapel in the middle of London Bridge that became the traditional starting point for pilgrims making their way to Canterbury. I'll link the history of the chapel in the show notes, but if you happen to be in London and can make your way to the north side of the Thames at London Bridge, the wonderful church of St. Magnus the Martyr has a diorama showing the old London Bridge, complete with the chapel of St. Thomas. So there I am, standing in the middle of modern-day London Bridge, overlooking the Thames with Andy Bull, getting ready to set out on pilgrimage. And it's around this time that Andy presents me with a small pilgrim token, modeled after those that pilgrims would have purchased along their journey to Canterbury or after they reached the cathedral. I shared the image of this pilgrim token on Instagram and Facebook, but it's a pin modeled after the saint showing Becket as Archbishop. And tokens like this replica were incredibly popular with pilgrims and very necessary actually for the church. Beyond being a source of revenue for the church, which they were, selling tokens like this actually helped protect the shrine of saints. Just like in modern times, visitors wanted a memento to remember their journey or to demonstrate their faith or just to show to others that they had made the pilgrimage. So prior to the wider availability of these usually 10 tokens, the tradition had been for pilgrims to try to chip off, actually to remove, a part of the stone shrine of the saint. So with tens of thousands of pilgrims coming to the shrine annually, you can begin to understand that if everyone is taking home a piece of the stone of the shrine of the saint, that presents a rather significant problem for the integrity of the reliquary. It wouldn't be long before there was no shrine left. So the tokens had a sentimental value, but also a very practical purpose. The British Museum recently completed its St. Thomas Becket exhibit. On display were many examples of these Becket pilgrim tokens, including some just like the one that Andy gave me. And one of the traditions for pilgrims after they return to London would be to visit the chapel of St. Thomas on the bridge, to make a prayer of thanksgiving for their safe passage and safe return, and then to snap that pilgrim token badge into 2 pieces and throw them into the Thames for good luck. And I think it's just so fascinating how much of these traditions, throwing something into a lucky fountain or casting your token into the Thames, follow us for a millennium in our secular day-to-day without even so much as a thought as to why we do these things. So pilgrims would break their badges, set their prayers off into the Thames. The British Museum has found thousands of these tokens, but far fewer that were actually unbroken. Now, for the record, I did not break mine, nor did I throw it into the Thames. I'm not sure that the environmental protocol is that we're doing that now in modern times, but to be honest, this pilgrim badge really means a lot to me because it was given by a friend who understood the importance of my journey. And I'm really quite grateful to have it. So thank you very much, Andy Paul.
The conversation continues momentarily. For information and links from the show, visit sacredstepspodcast.com. Know someone considering pilgrimage? Share this episode as a text from your device. Thank you for listening. To support the show, please leave a star rating in your podcast app. And now, the Sacred Steps podcast continues.
So from London Bridge, Andy and I went to Suffolk Cathedral for morning prayer and a pilgrimage blessing from Father Andrew. Let me say, if you're considering this walk, reach out to the Suffolk Cathedral and consider beginning your journey with a pilgrimage blessing. This ministry is such a reflection of the rich tradition the cathedral has in this borough and all the steps they want to undertake in supporting pilgrims. As you know, prior to my pilgrimage, I took the advice of a fellow Camino pilgrim, Johnny Walker Santiago, who said in season 1 that I should open my future pilgrimages to the prayers of others. I'd like to talk a little more about this later in the podcast, but in my backpack, I carried not only my own needs, but I was blessed to be entrusted with the prayer request of 71 others. So being able to carry these prayers and to read them and to pray for those who had asked me to do so in this historic cathedral was really quite special. And Father Andrew and Andy and I, we prayed together for a safe and meaningful journey. And I'm very grateful to Father Andrew for his blessing on my Camino. From Suffolk, I said my goodbyes to Andy, and I set out east along the Thames path towards Greenwich. Now, traditionally, pilgrims would have taken a different route out of London, but seeing as to how those are all now motorways, I wanted to stay on a little more scenic path and to avoid so many of the crosswalks and just some of the modern city elements that were conflicting with this 12th, 13th, 14th century narrative that I had created in my mind. Along the Thames, I did make one little indulgence to the touristy thing of standing on both sides of the prime meridian at the Greenwich Royal Observatory. In our many family trips to London, I had never been to the observatory. So that was a nice little detour to be able to put one foot in the Western Hemisphere, one foot in the Eastern Hemisphere. You may have seen that photo on my Instagram. Now, I'll share my path in the show notes, but my ultimate route veers a little from what you will find in Andy's book or in Britain's Pilgrim Places or in the Cicerone guidebook for the Pilgrim's Way, because I wanted to make my way to the Rochester Cathedral. A place of Christian worship since 604, Rochester Cathedral was once the second most frequented pilgrim destination in all of England. Thousands upon thousands of pilgrims came to Rochester, as I have now done, to pay tribute to St. William of Perth, who is the patron saint of adopted children. Inside the cathedral, you can see the old steps leading to the pilgrim door are now so worn down They're no longer horizontal. They have the curvature from so many steps and feet and knees walking on them. But they're so worn now that they're protected inside the expanded cathedral. You can also find a copy of King Ethelbert's laws there, the oldest English language laws predating the Magna Carta. So it was very special to me to be able to pray not only the prayers that had been entrusted to me, but to pray for my son in this historic cathedral devoted to St. William of Perth. Rochester is also the historic starting point for another walk, the Augustan Camino, linking the historic Roman Christian cities of Rochester, Canterbury, and Ramsgate in celebration of St. Augustine. Rochester itself is a very pleasant Kentish town on the Medway River. It has a lovely walking and shopping district down the main street with a number of restaurants and coffee shops, pubs and stores. And that terminates, that leads right to the Rochester Castle, which is one of the oldest waterfront castles in England. It's been owned over the centuries by English kings and French royalty, and even, I learned, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So if you're making your way along the more traditional Pilgrim's Way route, it's worth the detour up the Medway River. It's quite scenic to visit Rochester and its historic pilgrimage cathedral. From Rochester towards Canterbury, I made my way south, and the route is intertwined between the historic Pilgrim's Way and the North Downs Way. Here's something I didn't know, or maybe didn't pick up on in my preparations. I missed the literal naming convention of the English in thinking about the North Downs Way. I guess I presumed that downs meant low. And that is not the case at all. You see, you have the North Downs and the South Downs, and neither of those are low. It's the fertile valley between them that are the low areas. So the North Downs is actually a high chalk ridge overlooking the farms and fields of Kent. It's a beautiful walk, and the chalk downs are just ever so different underfoot. Not exactly dirt. The compacted chalk is somehow a little softer underfoot. I don't know how to describe it except to say that it was noticeable to me in many places that it was just a really pleasant track to walk. Maybe I was just tricking myself into thinking this, but very pleasant to walk. All of the North Downs Way is well marked. When you veer a bit into towns for shops or pubs, there's generally signage in the main crossing areas of towns and villages to return you to the North Downs, but it doesn't hurt to have a guidebook such as the Cicerone guidebooks, or to do as I did, carry the UK Ordnance Survey maps on your phone in the quite helpful OS Maps app. I'll link my GPS routes if you want to follow along. You'll find those in the show notes below. But the OS Maps app I actually found to be quite helpful, and the North Downs Way is very clearly delineated on the OS Maps app. One thing you'll also see in the maps and the app as you're making your way through these hillsides and countrysides are public footpaths. This is something we really don't have in the United States, so I want to remark on it for a moment. And if you're in the UK, I know there are some public campaigns going on right now to help protect the public footpath heritage. I would strongly encourage you to get involved in supporting these efforts, and I'll link them in the show notes below, but essentially just identifying what those public footpaths are so that they can be protected and maintained for the future. So in the UK, these footpaths essentially belong to the crown, or they belong to the people. These are routes that date far before private land ownership or recent developments in areas, and they're maintained and left open to the public. So here I was coming to the sty or gate and just walking across some man's farm along a faint track in the field. And the route through Kent does this a lot, walking across someone's orchard or walking through a farmer's dirt fields or walking past a vineyard and all sorts of private lands. And this is fantastic. And I truly wish we had this in the United States, because these public footpaths help ensure not only that these areas remain accessible as they have for hundreds and thousands of years, but that the traditions of these historic walks remain unspoiled, rather than being rerouted into some area that isn't historically accurate. If you tried to walk across someone's field in the United States, well, I don't know. You might be shot at, right? Someone walking through your corn or across your quote unquote private property. So kudos to the English for their networks of public footpaths, cycleways, and bridleways. And while I'm mentioning the accessibility of the Pilgrim's Way, let me also just mention the wonderful hospitality of the English people. In the pubs and in the markets and just along the streets, every person I came across was so warm and welcoming. Many of them have actually walked these routes and made their way, for example, to Canterbury. Pilgrimage is clearly on the minds of the people I was meeting. They're considering walking it themselves if they haven't before, and supporting those who are making these journeys. Many times someone would wish me a safe journey or offer to, be so kind as to just refill my water bottles. Just such a simple act of hospitality and care for someone. I know that groups like the British Pilgrimage Trust are trying to awaken this deeply rooted tradition in the UK. And I would say it's working. So to Britons considering walking these routes, and to those who may be considering going to the UK for a pilgrimage holiday, let me give the hospitality of these routes my highest compliments. And just to say, without question or hesitation, I will be back to walk in the UK, no question. Wonderful experience. All along the Pilgrim's Way, you find these charming towns and the hospitality and warm people, and just beautiful parish churches that have supported these areas for hundreds of years and welcomed pilgrims for hundreds of years. I found nearly all of them to be unlocked, open, and accessible, or that they were opened on my behalf if someone learned that I was walking pilgrimage and that the church was closed. I absolutely fell in love with the Kentish churches. Many of them along the Pilgrim's Way date back to about the 12th century, with the current buildings having been updated or refreshed around the 15th or 16th century. Now, because I was walking, I would come upon some of these churches at different times of the day, and they were largely vacant. And in talking to people around the villages, it's not terribly unusual, because the tradition of Christian practice in the UK is really undergoing a transformational time, often away from these small parish churches. But I'm so grateful to have found them open and welcoming. And just to say here, I'm not Anglican. These are not quote unquote my church. They were just open to people seeking a faithful place. And I think in my own spiritual journey, this really made my Pilgrim's Way walk richly rewarding. I don't have all of my answers, and I don't even know all of my questions to which I'm seeking answers. But time and time again, I found the doors of faith open and a quiet, contemplative place welcoming to me. I also found little benches just in the countryside, small places of solitude where I could literally, figuratively, and spiritually unburden myself for a few moments. If reflection is one of your goals for pilgrimage, I can tell you that I found it on the Pilgrim's Way. Two of the highlights from across the Kentish countryside that really touched me were Kit's Cody and the Lenham Chalk Cross. So first, Kit's Cody. Kit's Cody is what remains today of a Neolithic area burial chamber dating back to what's thought to be about 4000 BC. One of the best preserved examples of this chamber entrance. More than a few people commented on my Instagram photos how much Kit's Cody reminded them of like Stonehenge. This megalith covers a burial chamber, and to be honest with you, I ended up spending quite a bit of time at Kit's Cody. It's a special and sacred place where our ancestors interred their loved ones with great tradition and reverence. And today, it really only exists as a footnote on the land, with hundreds that would have been made just like it, I'm quite sure, just lost to time. English author Joe Francis Penn shared on the podcast a month or so ago how the intersection of permanence and transience guide our relationship with earth and with spirituality. And here was a very physical example of both permanence and transience. Kit's Cody remains. For 6,000 years, it has stood to reflect, by and large, what we presume its makers intended. And yet, hundreds of other examples just like it that would have been created to reflect these sacred burial sites have been lost to time forever. This was a place where it was easy to appreciate, but still hard to comprehend that we will all be lost to time. And that stayed with me and would become a really important aspect of how I would experience my pilgrimage later. So I'll talk about that more in a moment. But as you're walking, take a moment to appreciate Kit's Cody. It's near the Medway River, a bit between Aylesford and Rochester along the North Downs Way. A few days further walk ahead is the Lenham Chalk Cross. First constructed in 1922, the Chalk Cross is an incredible testament from a grateful community to the soldiers and families who sacrificed all in its defense. First built as a World War I memorial, the Chalk Cross is carved into the hillside just of farms and fields. It sits roughly 200 feet tall by 70 feet wide, and you can see this cross, this white cross on the hillside, for miles on the horizon, and by tens of miles from the air. The white chalk of the North Downs make it just a striking symbol against the green pasture land. During the Second World War, I learned that it was turned under to prevent the German pilots from using it as a navigation beacon in their attacks against England. But following the Second World War, was restored with the names of even more of the area's young men added to its granite marker stones. I found this such a moving example of the great love that is given towards the nation's soldiers and families who gave such sacrifice in defense of Great Britain. And you really see the World War I and World War II memories all across the Kent countryside. It's a reminder of how many gave so much, but even on homes and property 100 years later, there's memorials that say this was the home or this was the family farm of this young soldier, and it has their name and a poppy marker. And you don't see that as much in the United States. But the way you see it represented across the Pilgrims Way, at least, and in my experience across England, shows that those memories are very much still alive, and it was really touching to be there in those places. In a moment, I'm going to share stories of arriving in Canterbury, of the Via Francigena, and of walking the parting North Sea along the Pilgrim's path to Holy Island. But first, I'd like to share a little more insight for those who may be thinking about the Pilgrim's Way to Canterbury, especially in comparison to the Camino de Santiago. To be very clear, the Pilgrim's Way is not the Camino de Santiago. In all the very best ways, these are incredibly unique and very different walks. For example, where the Camino is heavily trafficked, and often very heavily so, the Pilgrim's Way is primarily a personal walk of solitude. On the Camino, you may meet and walk with hundreds of fellow peregrinos. On the English Pilgrim's Way, I would not expect to walk with anyone from outside your group and to meet others who may be cycling or walking the same route, the North Downs Way, perhaps 2 to 3 times per day. That is a real distinction to be aware of. Another important difference is the type of infrastructure that exists on both walks. So in almost every section of the Camino, you can find a cafe and an albergue every 3K to 5K at most. There are some notable exceptions, but that's kind of why we call them exceptions, right? On the Pilgrim's Way, you'll find cafes and inns in most towns and villages, but those may be separated by 10K or more apart. Or you may have to make a slight detour away from the main route in order to reach the inn that is your desired daily distance. It's not different in that you're going to be making a point-to-point walk. You don't need tents, you don't need cookware. All the food and lodging is available on the way, but the differing distances mean that, for example, you should go ahead and stop when you come to an English pub versus presuming you can walk on just another 30 minutes and find others. Logistically, just a bit more planning and a little more forethought. That said, it's a bit comforting to know exactly where you're going to be planning to stop. I'll also mention that there is a price differential. Communal albergues in Spain are hostels that charge 10 to 15 euro, and pilgrim meals are maybe approximately €5. In the UK, the inns are going to charge 60 to 80 pounds or more, and meals are easily 10 to 15 pounds. 2 different experiences, being in a private inn with a full meal versus a hostel and a pilgrim meal, but 2 very different price points as well. Lastly, arriving in Canterbury is a remarkably different experience than arriving in Santiago de Compostela. Let's talk about that next. A few other distinctions. The Camino has been the Camino for hundreds of years. So the culture is transient, and the locals are ingrained into that migration of pilgrims. The Pilgrim's Way passes through towns and villages where the culture is hyper-local. I mentioned how hospitable I found the walk, but that's just who the people are. It's certainly not a commercial tourism economy the way the Camino is in some areas. English, and almost exclusively English, is spoken along the Pilgrim's Way. If you don't speak English, you'll want to bring a translation app with you, because unlike the Camino, where there are multiple secondary and tertiary languages spoken and understood more broadly, that does not exist on the Pilgrim's Way. The UK itself is becoming largely a cashless society with phone payments, so very rarely are you doing cash payments, whereas the Camino has predominantly been a cash culture for decades. Although that's changing a bit now post-COVID, generally speaking, I would say take cash on the Camino, bring your phone payments, digital payments on the Pilgrim's Way. Lastly, the Camino is very much a Catholic structure, right? It's a Catholic construct. Spain is an overwhelmingly Catholic society. The Pilgrim's Way is now a Protestant Anglican walk rooted in Catholicism, but even still, England is just a plurality Christian nation. Not a majority, and certainly not overwhelmingly so. One of my favorite commonalities, let me just put this out there, the bacon bocadilla, the bacon buddy sandwich. There is nothing better than being able to start your day with grilled bacon on a baguette. You're welcome to disagree, but you would in fact be very wrong. In fact, I don't know if there's anything better than starting your day that way. And actually, one of the things that would get me up and get me going was a bit sore or a bit tired. Got to get down to the cafe and get a bacon buddy. For those who may not be familiar with the name, I'm talking about a bacon rowie up in Scotland or a rasher in Ireland. I'm not going to claim to know the name of this back bacon sandwich everywhere in the world, but if I'm walking there, there's a better than zero chance that that area has a bacon buddy sandwich generally available. All right, enough about the bacon bocadilla. But so I mentioned arriving in Canterbury is remarkably different than arriving in Santiago de Compostela. That great difference has nothing to do with the cities or the truly breathtaking cathedrals found in each of those revered towns. Rather, it has everything to do with the environment in which you find yourself arriving. Santiago de Compostela is at its core a shrine. Its cathedral is said to be the final resting place of St. James, the Apostle of Christ. It is the universal destination of the Camino, and arrival there is a celebrated tradition that has largely defined the city for hundreds of years. In its simplest terms, Santiago de Compostela, even in a modern sense, is a city for pilgrims. On the other hand, while Canterbury has indeed welcomed pilgrims for more than 800 years, its relationship to pilgrims was severed for hundreds of years as a result of the English Reformation. Everything that pilgrimage to Canterbury was literally destroyed by King Henry VIII. Not only was it made illegal to worship the saints, but the shrine and the very bones of St. Thomas Becket were pulverized and carted away by the king's soldiers. The monastery and the church were dissolved, and everything about St. Thomas Becket, everything about pilgrimage, everything that Canterbury is and was, ceased to exist. Now, Canterbury went on as a farming village, and generations of English people later, it would slowly be restored to Christian prominence. But that destruction of the shrine and the outlawing of pilgrimage worship reset the relationship with the English faithful, and most certainly reset Canterbury's relationship with pilgrims. Rather than this uninterrupted joining of faith and faithful, those lost years and lost traditions have changed how people view pilgrimage and how pilgrims are received even to this day in Canterbury. Pilgrims are made very welcome in Canterbury, but it is a much different experience to arrive as a pilgrim. All that is to say, Canterbury as a city, and even the cathedral itself to some degree, bustles around pilgrims rather than because of pilgrims. And to me, that was the biggest realization about the difference of arriving in Canterbury versus Santiago de Compostela. In much the same way that I found the Pilgrim's Way itself to be a more solitary experience, so was arriving in Canterbury. What for me was the emotional fulfillment of years of preparation and the exertion of miles and days to arrive was largely a private and personal moment. And after days of reflection and introspection, it was exactly the arrival I needed. So if you're planning to arrive in Canterbury as a pilgrim, let me encourage you to reach out to the Cathedral Pilgrim office in advance. They are gracious and accommodating. They asked if I'd like to receive a blessing for my pilgrimage and toured me through the cathedral complimentary. And the cathedral is stunning. For those that may not be aware, Canterbury Cathedral is the head church of the Anglican faith, the Church of England. England has so many beautiful cathedrals, and Canterbury is certainly among the most so. At the advice of many, I paid a little more to stay at the cathedral grounds at the Canterbury Cathedral Lodge, and many of the photos that you may have seen on my Instagram and Facebook page of the exterior of the cathedral are actually taken from the lodge. After I arrived and toured the cathedral, I attended Evensong, which is the traditional sung worship service. I found this to be really just incredibly beautiful. And whether you're making pilgrimage or not, if you get the opportunity to attend Evensong at Canterbury, or maybe in London, you go to Evensong at Westminster, I would highly recommend that you do so. It's a smaller service, and you're sitting in the choir, the Q-U-I-R-E section of the church, and looking up upon Trinity Chapel and the eternal flame that marks the lost shrine of St. Thomas Becket. It's just incredibly special. That evening, I received a blessing in Trinity Chapel at the foot of the eternal flame. And this is a part of the cathedral that's normally not accessible for guests. It's not part of the place you can walk through as a tourist due to its sacred nature and its age. And everyone had left for the evening, and it was myself, the priest, the verger, and one other pilgrim who was supported by a few of her gathered friends. And the priest said a prayer for myself and for Caroline, and he blessed us. And there, in that place, I have to tell you, I was completely open to and certainly felt the presence of God. The other pilgrim, Caroline, and I talked about our pilgrimages for a few moments after the prayers. She had walked a different route to Canterbury called the Old Way, which connects Southampton to Canterbury Cathedral. It's actually quite a long walk, and her journey was just concluding, whereas I was to begin walking from Canterbury towards Rome the following morning. She was happy to arrive, but I sensed in her she was a bit sad that the walk was finishing. She reached in her backpack and she pulled out this little shell, this little pilgrim token. Caroline told me she received this little medallion from a pilgrim named Lucy, who had reached the end of her journey and given it to her. Lucy had gotten it from the vicar of Wilmington, who had been given this gift from a local potter there in Wilmington. And she asked me if I would carry it on. And I tried very hard to decline, because looking at Caroline and just sensing the emotion as she was holding it, I didn't think she wanted to part with it. I could tell it was just very special to her. But more special was being asked to carry it forward. I want you to know, Caroline, that I have carried that shell with me, and I will carry it just a little further until I can pass it to another who will carry it further still. So there with Caroline, there were some tears and hugs and pictures. A moment that night when our pilgrim families grew just a little bigger. And perhaps a bit more to share about Canterbury. But let's save that for the next episode, shall we? On our next episode, which is immediately available right now, I'll be sharing the stories of walking the English route of the Via Francigena and walking the Pilgrim's path across the parting sea to Holy Island. If you haven't done so already, please click subscribe on YouTube or your podcast app so that this upcoming episode is available for you automatically. Immediately after this podcast, streaming now, episode 6, I want to share with you the moments of standing in the ruins of St. Augustine's Abbey, walking the historic route of bishops towards Rome, climbing the cliffs of Dover, the gale force winds and storms that I found at the shore of the North Sea, and walking the Pilgrim's path across the sands as the morning tides parted. I hope you'll join me on our very next episode, episode 6, streaming right now on the Sacred Steps podcast.
This has been the Sacred Steps Podcast. Visit sacredstepspodcast.com for episode notes, links, or to contact Kevin. Watch us online on YouTube. We read every comment. Please add your review and feedback. Before you go, tap subscribe to have episodes added to your playlist. Until next time, buen camino.